welcome everyone to the Provider Alliance second iteration of our performance-based contracting webinar series, What to Know and How to Succeed. We appreciate everybody taking the time to join us this morning as we continue to navigate this pretty significant change for IDA services in Pennsylvania. My name is Craig Douglas. I am joining Patrick and Travis today to support them through the webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items as we get started here. We are recording the session today, so as we typically do after the session, we'll provide materials and a link to the recording so everybody gets a chance to, that miss it, gets a chance to see the webinar. We are using the Q&A feature today and chat, so I'll make sure that all that's enabled for you if you have any questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, we have a relatively small group today. We can certainly unmute mics, and if there's a question for Travis or Patrick as we go through the session today, please feel free to use that feature and we'll get you hooked up. And with that, I will turn it over to Patrick to kind of get us started.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So, and Craig, heads up, you mentioned Travis. Of course, we'll bring Travis in, introduce you, Travis, in a couple of moments. But if we're able to drop into chat contracts, the old contract, new contract, we're going to reference those. So we'd like to be able to get those out to you to see. We're not going to read through them in a lot of detail, but we do want to do a little bit of a sort of a verbal side-by-side on what's happening with contracting. So, and a couple of other things, Craig, just heads up. We will be referencing our recent TPA comment letters, so if you can drop those in the chat at the appropriate times as well. Before we really get into the meat of that discussion, we just wanted to cover a few general announcements. So, you know, there's recently been an ISAC meeting, and there's also been, as many of you know, participated in a series of performance-based contracting summits. So with those, there's a lot of information that's been coming out, of course, over recent months. One of them being the one-time supplemental payments. These are the funds that ODP had pushed out really as the budget was being announced. So our understanding is, first of all, over 90% of organizations did apply. Fortunately, that's not 100%. So it always disappoints us when people eligible don't apply, but it sounds like the vast amount of the dollars were claimed. They should be hitting remittance advices. We have been advised on Monday. As typical of recent practice, it should go through the service location where you have the most claims in dollars, so you can look for that. I think that's pretty widely communicated. It has been so far. So you can look for that. Hopefully that meets expectations in terms of how you have calculated it. There's also been talking both of the sessions for performance-based contracting, as well as noted at the ISAC meeting. Waiver applications, of course, waiver application and related materials were put out for public comment. So comments have been received. Everything was due on both proposed rates and the waivers and everything related to performance-based contracting by June the 4th. ODP has clearly received a lot of comment, and they are making revisions, but the application of the waivers, they are still expecting on or about a July 1st submission to CMS for the approval of the waiver amendments that affect both performance-based contracting and other elements of the existing consolidated community living and PFDS waivers. So there are some things related to timeline, I think, that may shift a little bit. We'll probably get into this on a few of the particulars today. I do want to call out the continued need for advocacy on the budget. I know that the TPA Advocacy Committee, as well as the committees of all the associations and other stakeholder groups across the state, continue to be very active. Fortunately, the media continues to be very active for us. But we want to remind all members to continue to reach out to your legislators, continue to make contact with them. I'll bother you, Craig, one more time, even if you're able to put our voter voice or just our ACT page link. It's an easy click. We ask people to do this. Even if you participate with other associations, do it there, do it here. Do it again. It all counts if you've done it before. Many people I see in our database do it quite frequently. It's just a good way to make sure that all of the members of the Pennsylvania General Assembly know about the importance of the investment in the fee schedule rates, and that we get a budget approval that actually enables the fee schedule rates to be increased as proposed. So we also want to remind everybody that in addition to reaching out in a very simple way of just clicking and letting your legislator know that you support this, how much you support this investment, It was recently announced that the Pennsylvania General Assembly will recess. Actually, I would assume beginning today. They will not be in session next week. So that means they will be in their districts. So if you have the opportunity to reach out in person, if you have a good relationship already with your senator and House member, we urge you to reach out to them in their district. If you haven't reached out, we urge you to begin now by letting them know, again, the importance of this investment. So we'll try to make that simple, easy. I know upcoming on our June 28th membership meeting, I'm sure by then on June 28th, we will have some sort of update on the budget. I'd also like to announce here that the associations, the provider associations across PA, do have a press conference at the Capitol on June the 26th. So a couple of days before our meeting, we will get some information out about that. Space is somewhat limited according to policy at the Capitol, but we know many members like to go and attend. We know it's also very difficult for many members, individuals, families to travel, but we will keep you posted. The messaging will be delivered very strongly. In some of the ACT page references that Craig has dropped into the chat, you can see very simple handouts, things that have been developed by all of the Pennsylvania provider associations that you can use that have kind of been vetted by all of us that we believe contain very accurate, timely information. So we have the press conference coming up at the Capitol June 26th. I will also announce that with everything going on, our June 28th meeting, which will also serve as our TPA annual meeting, we'll talk about budget. Rick Smith has confirmed also to join us to cover some of the financial policies related to ODP in general, certainly related to some of the things that are going on and will be happening with performance-based contracting. So Rick and I had intended to meet prior to June 28th anyway. We thought it might be a good opportunity if Rick had the time and was willing to do so, to come out and really have that conversation publicly. So far I've asked Rick to really kind of call out the things from the summits from a financial policy perspective, and also a good time for him to be available to answer some questions we may have between now and then. So again, I've said fee schedule rates numerous times here. I won't belabor it anymore in the moment, but it is important to recognize that without the approved budget, the fee schedule rates will not be enacted. It's very clear from not just a budgetary standpoint, it's outrightly stated in the publication that the enactment of these rates is contingent upon budget approval. So once again, I remind everybody the importance of doing that. So our TPA conference is coming up on July 26th. Earlier this week, we opened registration and announced the opening of registration for both attendees. And we also opened the opportunities for sponsorships and exhibitors. And I'm really happy and pleased to report and want to thank all of you who've already registered or agreed to participate in some way. We've had a really great response out of the gate. So I want to bring Craig back in to just talk about this a little bit. So Craig, let me flip it back to you because I know how active you've been in the organizing of this. So what most would you like to say?
Well, I think first thing I just want to mention is we appreciate everybody's patience as we continue to work on this new platform. We had a little snag in getting people early on the first day registered into the conference. So we appreciate everybody taking the time and being patient with us. I think all of that is resolved now. So if you do want to register for the event, whether you're a member or a non-member, all you need to do is put an email in and our system will walk you through the registration process. So it's relatively simple. Again, the conference is free for all TPA members, and any staff person or representative within your member organization is welcome to attend for free. And anybody who's a non-member, we are charging $149 this year for that participation. So anybody who's a non-member, we certainly encourage you to join TPA. These events are definitely a big benefit of membership. So certainly something to consider as you look into the next year. If anybody has any questions or you have any challenges registering for the event, send a message to information@provideralliance.org. You can also download our mobile app, TPA Connect, and we would be happy to. You can send us a message right through that application as well. And we will, as Patrick mentioned, we did open sponsorship and exhibitor applications. We will be following up with all of those individuals who expressed interest in this in the next day or so. So again, we're super excited about the upcoming conference. We hope you are too, and we're looking forward to seeing everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And I should probably mention, we had many people indicate they wanted to help support in some way through exhibiting or sponsorship. So, Craig, just jump in where I'm wrong here, but we basically kind of surveyed people, and should probably say, Craig and I are going to be looking at that after this meeting. So we will be promptly getting back to everybody who's already expressed their desire to be a sponsor of the event. The communication that went out earlier this week is really detailed, I think, detailed enough at least on what you get for the sponsorship levels. And in terms of the conference itself, this will be the third year that we're coming back live. I think we've done a little bit better job in terms of managing it and content. And we're going to replicate what we did last year, which we thought was really effective and we got good feedback on, in that we want to have panels throughout the day. So we had great panels. As you see in the graphic, Kristen will be there, but in addition to Kristen, she's always great about bringing the leadership team from ODP. So, last year we had Rick, we had Dr. Chirpus, we had Lauren House, Jeremy Yale, Michelle O'Toole. I'm probably even missing a few people. In the past, I know we've had Julie Michon. So we really expect it to be really robust representation, participation from ODP, but not just ODP. We already have Donna Martin from Anchor secured. Just the other day, Joe Macbeth agreed to join us in person, very critical in terms of all of the NADSP, eBadge Academy, a lot of the dialogue going on between ODP providers and the National Alliance of Direct Support Professionals. So we're really pleased to have Joe to talk about workforce. But these will be panel discussions, not necessarily, we don't anticipate really presentations on topics. We'd like to have different perspectives on these panel discussions. So again, we welcome everybody to join us. It's great to be able to do a live event. Hopefully we have budget information. Hopefully we have a lot of feedback from what's changed based on your comments to performance-based contracting, some more news on rates, and a good time to really assemble, get together, network, and we'll have a lot of activities to help facilitate that. So with that, we will move on here. I think what to know, we really outlined a few things, and there is so much information right now. I think we're going to focus a lot today in terms of some of the details. We will definitely get into some perspective on success and strategy and some things that we would like for TPA to think about and for you to think about and have some dialogue about that. I also anticipate, and we will see how the rest of the session goes, we might have some time to have some sort of dedicated Q&A and discussion among members. We know many of you have been participating in the summits. So we're really interested to hear not just your questions, but your takeaways. And I expect in many cases, some of you in the room here today could answer questions of other members. So we'll try to allow some time for that. Again, we'll see how that unfolds. We also welcome you to kind of jump in as questions arise and you think of things as we're on a particular topic. So briefly, we want to go through the contract, of course. We do want to talk a little bit about public comments, both what we've heard feedback regarding ODP on in terms of some apparent flexibility. We want to go through the TPA comments a little bit. We want to extract some of the information and high-level takeaways from the 3 summits that have taken place. And we want to talk a little bit about implementation timeline. With respect to that, the information due dates for July 31 include, at this point, as we understand, surveys from providers, attestations on things that you are agreeing you will conduct and perform, and your provider contracts. So if we can go to the next slide, Craig, we'll start to jump into provider contracts. And with that, I want to welcome in Travis Geary from K&L Gates. Travis, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I guess I should also kind of talk about the fact that you're not just in here as a contracts expert today. I certainly want to acknowledge your role for I guess I'd say too long now in terms of involvement directly in the rate appeals of many of our members. And rate appeals have recently, of course, morphed into a lot of discussion on the implications of policy, investment, rates, and performance-based contracting. So I just want to make sure everyone realizes, Travis, you've been really engaged in those discussions in a really frontline way. And as you may or may not know, Travis also interacts regularly every week. All the appeal groups across PA get together on a weekly call and just sort of share information And again, we get a wealth of news and information just from those discussions. So Travis, you've been very close to everything here. So I just want to remind our members of that. We're here to talk about the contract. So I just kind of want to turn it over to you to sort of introduce yourself on anything that I may have missed. And then kind of start with your high level takeaways of the contract and maybe a little bit about the contracting process and the context with which these contracts have been put out.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. As Patrick mentioned, Tony Holtzman, another lawyer with my firm, and I have been working pretty closely with Patrick and some of the provider groups, and it's a pleasure to do that. And thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit about the contracts that were sent out, the Agreement for Provisions of Residential Services, as they're officially titled. And to the providers I mean, some of you may not even recall that I assume each one of you are already currently operating under a previous contract provider agreement for participation in Pennsylvania's Consolidated Person Family Directed Support and Community Living waivers. That was a contract that was effective January 1st of 2018 when ODP switched over to the fee schedule rates. Some of you, received a blank contract for the new selective or performance-based contracting, and some of you were a little caught off guard because it's effective January 1st, 2025, but the letter that accompanied it said the signed contracts have to be submitted by July 31st, 2014 or 2024. I'm sorry. So Patrick sent me a copy of the previous 2018 contract, and basically, we just did a side-by-side comparison, and frankly, they're really not significantly different. Everything that is in the 2018 contract is also in this contract to be effective in January 2025. Really, the only addition is this new contract specifically mentions performance-based contracting and the compliance with the performance complaint-based contracting waiver. And if you'll see from the old contract, basically in signing that, the provider essentially agrees to comply with all the terms and conditions set forth in the waiver and by ODP. And so this new contract is very similar, except it also includes that the provider agrees to comply with the regulations that apply to the performance-based contracting waiver and to comply with the approved performance-based contracting waiver, including all the standards enumerated in the residential services definitions, and it goes on. So frankly, there's not a significant, other than I don't want to downplay the switch over to performance-based contracting. That is a significant change in the way ODP is going to be doing business with you guys. But as for the language of the contract itself, it's really not significantly different by signing it. All you're doing is saying you agree to comply with the terms and conditions and regulations that are in place. And frankly, it's ODP's way of getting an agreement in place where they can pay you for services. How you're going to be paid will change based on the performance-based contracting. I'm sure Patrick's going to talk about that. The biggest thing to know from it is, as of right now, the date to return the signed contract is firm at July 31st of this year. ODP has said that every current provider isn't going to be entitled to play in the new arena. So if you get your contracts in, you should be good to go. If you don't get your contracts in, at least as of this point, then you're not going to be an approved provider, and effective January 1st, you're going to be cut off. So if you have any questions, either today or anytime in the future, feel free to reach out. You can give me a call, give me an email, or contact me through Patrick. But that's basically the nuts and bolts of the new contract. Now, it will have implications because, as Patrick's going to go through the details of performance-based contracting, you're going to have to comply with all of that. You're going to be subject to all the performance standards and whatnot. that's included in the performance-based contracting program. The other thing to note is, the contract does provide that it can be terminated either by ODP or by the provider with 30 days written notice. So that's the nuts and bolts on the contract. I don't know, Patrick, if you have anything else to add or questions, or if anyone else has questions.
Yeah, we'll watch for questions. Craig,
Yeah.
please, as always, help me out there. And Travis, yeah, I guess I would sort of jump back in by saying, so it appeared to me that, they pretty much took the boilerplate language from what I'll call the 2018 contract. So when residential services went fee schedule January 1st, 2018, I know there's alignment between those dates. That seems to me that's when provider contracting was being discussed, but over the years, they're always introducing sort of more documents and requirements. But there's, as you said, there's not a whole lot new here. And what is new is very specific to providers will comply with the performance-based contracting standards. Providers will submit data to ODP for the assignment of tiers. So I think that, I think there's 7 enumerated elements of this contract, and the ones that I sort of looked at as completely new were 4, 5, and 6. And those kind of address what I just said. Deliver residential services in a manner consistent with residential performance standards, provide information and data for the assignment of tiers by ODP, and basically then to receive a tier assignment from ODP. So the specifics to that level are in there. But that said, the specifics of what are performance standards, and there's really no reference, kind of surprisingly, to pay for performance. That I noticed. If I'm wrong, and you can call that out as well, Travis. But again, something I'll make a comment on a little bit later with respect to the waiver application too. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. And Craig, if you want to go to the next slide, we've kind of pulled out for you some things Travis just said, but this is sort of the cover letter. And this kind of lays out the requirements. You have an opportunity to mail. There's a mailing address on the correspondence you would have received. And Craig, thank you. Something you called out is, if you haven't received or don't think you've received your contract yet, is it the QA&I contract, Craig? Is that your understanding? There may be, in some cases, somebody that's not with your organization any longer. So, if that's the case, or anybody's experiencing that, take a look first. Craig, did I state that correctly? First of all.
Yeah, that's correct. If you haven't updated your QA&I update, your contract may be sort of out in limbo. So always good to double check that.
Yeah, so there's a mailing address. There is a specific email address to which you can send this back as an attachment. So yeah, Travis, I'll let you kind of respond then to what I laid out, though, in terms of, you kind of see it that way. Is that kind of consistent with your evaluation of the contract?
Yeah, and I will just kind of stress what you and Craig just talked about. If any of the providers out there, if you have not yet received the contract, the blank contract from ODP, you should reach out and get that, because it must be submitted by July 31st, 2024. And Patrick's right. I mean, there's no specific mention in the pay for performance, or it's pretty vague and just says you'll comply with the standards, provide the information to be assigned a tier, and as you look at the performance-based contracting information, the providers will be evaluated on an annual basis and assigned a tier on an annual basis, and whatever tier you're assigned, you will be in for a year. There's no way to move up or down. Well, I shouldn't say down. I mean, you can have, you can be revoked if you're doing something wrong, but there's no way to move up to a higher tier until the next evaluation period. And the other interesting thing is, while they do say, the contract says you will comply with all the requirements and the regulations and the standards, those standards, I mean, Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but those standards technically aren't set yet, because I don't believe the waiver has been approved. Is that correct?
Yeah, waiver's not even been submitted. So
Yeah.
I mean, all of the activity around the summits is really acknowledging what we've put out there as ODP, as the state, in terms of what we've told you in writing. We are still analyzing comments. There may be changes, but of course, given the timeline, they are moving ahead with preparation. Walking through all of those 83 performance standards, I think the presentations are clearer than they are in the written document. So I appreciate what ODP is doing. I think they're giving some background data as a foundation in many areas. And I think we are learning a lot as we go along. So Travis, as we sort of try to wrap up this conversation on contracts, if there are any questions, we encourage you to ask your questions, particularly with Travis on the call here, to answer anything technically. We did develop a poll question because in discussions with some members I've had recently, some of you have submitted your contracts. I was just curious how many have really just taken a look at it. And as we open that poll, I'll make a few comments in terms of, when ODP said, you're going to get a contract, you're going to have to sign it by June 30th. It'll be out June 1st. The discussion we were having earlier, I mean, that sounds kind of outrageous on its face, but understanding there was a provider contract, I think in discussions, I'm slowly realizing maybe people had sort of forgotten about the existence of the underlying contract. That's a pretty simple, straightforward contract. I'm sure in ODP's mind, we're not changing that a whole lot, which we now know, but we didn't know previously. So I think as you get the contract, see it, if you've already gone through the exercise Travis and I just talked about, kind of compare them, you look and see, okay, it's making some pretty high level assessments and including some things about performance-based contracting. And I think to your point, Travis, it's not like it's locking you in, you must do these things, you must comply with their performance standards. And I don't think there's anything from my vantage point of view that was anything unexpected in this contract. It was probably a little lighter than I even would have expected. So it looks like we've got about 39% saying they've already returned their contracts, about 43% no, about 18% not sure yet what your organization has done. So good, it's a good distribution. I think it also sort of speaks to the fact that once you've seen it, nothing scary. You need to get it in order to take next steps with ODP and not put a roadblock up for yourself that you can't get a tier assignment. So I think it's a good thing to dispatch with, but there was a lot of controversy over it. In fact, it's what we led with in our comment letter because we recognized and we even sensed early on that of course ODP was going to move on that because they were late getting the contracts out, later than they anticipated, I should say. So I think the point of emphasis here, I would say, the important thing to note now is everybody is receiving a contract or should receive a contract. So if you're sitting out there wondering, am I being included? I'm a residential provider. Is ODP including me or they decide not to include me? The answer is by policy, everybody is included. Going forward, that will likely change. I think the language of all of the performance-based contracting documents makes it very clear. And the waiver itself is a selective contracting Medicaid waiver. It does give the state the authority to contract with whom they want and choose. But I think now, out of the gate, unlike many, what I'll say, managed care implementations, where there's some weeding out right on the front end through a commercial managed care organization, that is not what ODP is doing. So make sure you receive a contract, make sure you submit it, as Travis just stated, by the deadline. There's still plenty of time to do that, but being extended to July 31st. If you have questions, certainly reach out to us. We can connect you with Travis if you have your own in-house counsel and you want a particular element looked at. But I think this is boilerplate. This is what ODP is doing. And I think at this point in time, this is where we are. Unless there's questions, I would certainly encourage all members, take a look, but promptly turn it back in unless you have really serious concerns. And I think those concerns can be addressed in other ways without hindering your ability to really proceed in the system. Because remember, the fee schedule increases, everybody is going to be assigned to some tier. It's not a question of you deciding, unless it is a question of, are we going to do business in this environment or not? You certainly want to protect your rights to continue to do business at your discretion. So I think we can close that poll out. Travis, thank you for joining us today. We're going to get into a few takeaways here. We're going to go through our comment letters, and you're welcome to stick around and jump in with any comments you have. I know you're familiar with a lot of the comments and feedback. And before I totally thank you for being here and say goodbye for now, Craig, do we have anything out there from anybody or any? I'll just do a call out if there's not any questions for Travis.
We just have a general question out there as to how performance-based contracting is aligning with the standards that the department has to follow for rulemaking. So the question is whether or not this transition is in any way a violation of that rulemaking process.
Travis, that comes up a lot. So definitely that's a question for you, because I know this comes up in discussion of rate appeals and related activities. So do you want to certainly comment on that, Travis?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's kind of a technical question. I will say that it seems to me that ODP is promulgating this change the same way that they have, historically promulgated the fee rate schedule changes. And many of many of you have appealed some of those fee rate changes, essentially because they're inadequate or insufficient. And one of the arguments that we raise in those appeals is that they're not following the proper method of implementing, and this is, this may be getting too technical, but we say these are basically, these are binding norms upon, Commonwealth wide. So they're essentially rules, and there's a statutory way in which rules must be promulgated. And that, we can frame an argument that ODP is not following that because they don't go through all of the steps that are required. ODP's position is they have a regulation in place that says they can do it this way, so they do. I guess the short answer is there could be an argument that this is not implemented in the proper way, but in order to challenge that, you'd have to do an appeal.
Yeah, and Travis, I'll jump in and say, yeah, you can always decide to disagree, right? But the department does cite case law. I mean, they're pretty firm on we're doing this the right way.
Yeah.
It's a regulated system. It's federal dollars. I would say they certainly don't communicate any cracks in their defense. I mean, they feel solidly and squarely they can issue a regulation, and then they can promulgate rates as they choose if that regulation sort of frames it that way and it's compliant with other things with which they need to conform. So, and I guess I should step back and say, I interpreted the question the way you just answered it as well, Travis, that is this basically bypassing or sidestepping regulation, and should performance-based contracting be put through the regulatory process? So the question, if that's not what you were asking, because there's a lot of federal rulemaking, and there is discussion about access to Medicaid rule, the overtime rule, as it is commonly known, has a bearing on performance-based contracting more directly on fee schedule rates. So if that was the angle of your question intent, just please clarify. And if there's something else you'd like Travis to comment on with respect to performance-based contracting, some of the other federal rulings, and there are many of them actually at play right now, we can get into that a little bit with the benefit of you being here, Travis. I would want certainly you to answer a lot of those questions, but I'll give a moment to see if any of that does come in, and we can circle back to it certainly. So with that, I think we sort of covered provider contracts here. Travis, any other final thoughts, takeaways, anything that you would certainly want to make sure members know in addition?
No, I think we're good. Just, the biggest thing is the July 31st hard deadline. And I'm going to turn my video off, but I'll stick around if anybody has any questions.
Okay, good. We'll pull you back in as needed. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, so I think we can move on. I think the points of emphasis, we've already sort of made those in terms of, high level step back. What does this mean? Why did you get a new contract? There's a new waiver. It affects right now residential providers, and ODP obviously wants to kind of lock in on not just what your expectations are, but the follow through and information they're going to need from all providers in order to sort of execute, most notably on the tier assignments. So we'll get into some of the things. I think that probably want to cover, at least at a high level, a few things from recent comment letters. I first of all want to make sure I thank and acknowledge everybody who has submitted comments. I think, particularly with something that is a new system change and new model, the impact on individual organizations can really only be articulated clearly by you on that impact. It's been very clear. I know Kristen has talked about the volume of comments. She has not been hesitant about saying where comments have weighed in very heavily. So I think that we will try to capture some of that in sort of where we see perspective. Again, I think today, because of where we are in the midst of these provider summits, so much activity, so much detail going through the performance standards as part of the summits, we do want to conclude with some perspective and some thoughts and recommendations. But I also think we want to be clear in terms of how we lay out the detail and some of the things that have happened recently, not just from what ODP is telling us, but what you have been reporting and what we've tried to capture in comments back to ODP in terms of the implications on providers, individuals, and families of setting this new system change in motion. So I guess, Craig, if you're able to kind of drop or link to our comment letters, they are on our website. I think we submitted comment letters on performance-based contracting May 30th, on the rates on June 3rd. So while I think many other organizations and maybe associations may have combined letters, I think in a couple of cases, I know some organizations combine their comments into a single letter. We took the approach of separate notices, sent separate letters. I do also want to say that the provider associations that have been working together in advocacy, we did share our letters with one another. We had some discussions on what have recently been, I guess, bi-weekly or so calls to sort of stay gathered around our strategy, outreach to legislators, reporting back on what we're hearing on the budget toward making sure the investment into rates occurs. So I think that we've really vetted out a lot of things. With respect to our own letter, I mean, we have stayed high level. That has typically been our policy and practice. You can read our letter, but I'll just briefly go through some of the things we put into the letter, and in some cases where we sort of sense whether there has been a little bit of movement or not on these issues. So provider contracts was really the first thing that we referenced. So we called that out. I mean, it was really kind of, we expected something to change on this, but we did want to call out the reasons and the importance of it. So we do have that in there as something that we called out. The provider profiles with respect to tier assignments and new referrals. So this, again, was an area where there's several instances in the performance standards where if you're a primary provider, you're really only to accept new referrals or only receive new referrals for needs groups 1 and 3. There's profiling around where you have to be with respect to the HRST level, where you have to be in the needs level of the individual you serve for all the consumers you serve in your organization. So these have some major implications for organizations. So we called this out in a fairly detailed way. We likewise called out the provision of less than 10 individuals would not have an opportunity to qualify for select residential or for clinically enhanced service tiers. So we had called that comment out largely because ODP had messaged pretty strongly. We believed that it was looking to protect small providers and recognizing that some of those small providers are already serving needs group 4 and 5. We just believed that smaller providers should have the opportunity likewise to participate. And it's probably going to be more difficult for you as a smaller provider, but you should not be precluded out of the gate by rule. So we know there was a lot of controversy around the use of calendar year performance data from 2023. Again, this could be a disqualifying factor for meeting tiers in many instances. So that is something that we called out in a detailed way. The requirement to meet all performance standards. So whether it's worded as 100% or just as all standards, that it is very clear and remains clear in writing that you have to meet all standards. So while some can be done through attestations because the data doesn't exist from 2023, it's a brand new standard, there's no data available, that is a standard that remains in writing. But I will say that on several of these, obviously the provider contract, the profile tier assignments, if you've been on the summit sessions, you've heard Kristen sort of indicate some flexibility here. Likewise, they received a lot of comments on the fewer than 10 individuals. I'm not hearing as much movement toward attestation on 2023 performance data. However, if there is flexibility on the requirement below to meet 100% of the standards, that can sort of alleviate some of the concern or automatic disqualification that would occur if they're using that 2023 performance data. So all of this still very unclear, remains to be seen. Nothing changed yet. The documents do remain the documents as written. So Craig, if you can go to the next slide, the remainder of our performance-based contracting comment letter addressed these items, pay for performance criteria, where we essentially said this remains an unknown, and we encouraged ODP to quickly identify these areas, reassemble the strategic thinking group to put more work into these, or to just put out in draft form to the stakeholder community so these could be finalized and we could have some more clarity on the areas that ODP is looking at for pay for performance. So if you've been on the summits, again, you know, I think that their presentation is pretty clear on this. It's a lot clearer than the written documents as published originally, that what particular areas will qualify for pay for performance. That makes it a little clearer what they're looking for, but the criteria, we don't really have anything more than what was published in terms of what payment may look like, qualifications. So still remains very open-ended. The performance analysis vendor, you know, we called this out because this was a little murky from the start. It appears many places from the implementation plan, was in the original concept paper. It's worded and referenced throughout. It's of course in the waiver application that ODP proposed. So I guess the day one announcement, which I believe the first session occurring on June the 3rd, was that this was something that was not going to be put in place until 2026. So my takeaway, I'm interested if others felt differently, that this was kind of shrugged off. You know, we are going to be able to do this at ODP, no worries. I guess, again, from the point of view of our comment letter, we sort of saw this as the number crunchers, how much of this would be public facing, how much of this could be access to help providers, guide them, provide technical support. So I see this as a blow because I was hopeful that this would guide the next item in our letter, which was really technical assistance. This is a major transformational undertaking. And while we acknowledge and respect the fact that ODP will continue to do quarterly summits, sort of day to day as this unrolls very rapidly, you know, we really feel there needs to be point of contact and people identified within ODP and within their contractors that can really help navigate this change for the provider system and for all the people who are served by it. Reinvestment was a theme. I'll talk a little bit about this when we do a little bit of a financial analysis, but making sure resources can be deployed back into services, back into the work of service providers for infrastructure and for development and workforce, and many other things that we have feel that have been sort of underinvested in at this point in time. So sustainability, a theme throughout. There's sort of more to say, and actually our other comment letter, we continue to maintain the need for a market index, a COLA, some form of ongoing adjustment, particularly in what's been communicated by the governor and his administration in terms of addressing intellectual disability and autism services as part of a multi-year growth strategy to eliminate the emergency waiting list of over 6,000 people not receiving services and still shore up existing services and manage our workforce in such a way that capacity can grow and meet the needs of everyone. Ongoing communication and engagement. You know, you can read what's written. I'll probably hold off and make comment on this as we go through things a little bit more. I'd like to establish a little bit of a foundation in some of the numbers before I talk a little bit further about that. But I promise to circle back to that. And Craig, you can remind me if I fail. So we'll go on to the next slide here. I do want to get into the proposed fee schedule rate comment letter. There's some overlap here, which is why I included it today. So Craig, if you haven't already, if you can drop that in or the link to where you can find this. We have pretty consistently, I think regularly since we've ever commented upon any of the fee schedule rates going back in time, the equitable distribution. This was more equitable than the 2022 fee schedule rate adjustments, but still not across the board where every service that is dependent and reliant upon a DSP to provide that service got similar increases. So increases, really, I won't go to all the outlier rates and rates that in many instances don't serve that many people. But by and large, we said the range is roughly for the vast majority of the rates about 5 to 15%. So we further state that under no measure of inflation would 5% be sufficient. Now 5% is needs group 5. Some other work was done there, of course. Many of you would have hopefully benefited from the creation of needs group 5. But there are some other rates, and we did want to make sure that from our perspective, we're locking in on equitable distribution and the fact that rates have fallen far behind inflation. And in fact, were never really updated to inflation the last time they were updated. We spent a lot of time on overtime, thanks to the members who really called this out. I think this is one example where ODP's documentation is really vague and or ambiguous in terms of what they have done. So we have sought to get some more documentation to sort of back up practices from last rate assumptions to these rate assumptions. Just to call out a couple of things, they do acknowledge in rate assumptions a 40% turnover factor. They do acknowledge in writing elsewhere, including performance-based documents, performance-based contracting documents, 23% vacancy. So the overtime just doesn't really seem to stack up. And read literally, we take the assumptions and therefore the rates to mean that ODP has incorporated no overtime for the fee schedule rates with respect to residential services. So I won't get into it any further. It's called out in a lot of detail within the letter. Administration, again, we were already making a case administration was by formula 10% and was not sufficient. And now you layer on the implementation of performance-based contracting standards and all of the federal rules, most notably the overtime rule, which changes July 1, the very day that our fee schedule rates are intended to be effective. So there is requirement under regulation, back to the question that Travis fielded. Regulations are supposed to incorporate changes at the federal, state, and local levels. And we feel strongly that it should incorporate the changes at the federal level and just be more on point with the actual data that we have demonstrated and that the state has acknowledged. So the last couple of items, we really feel strongly, again, we reference the current legislation that's been proposed to provide a market index for IDA services. We call it the IDA augmentation account. This is an account funded through fiscal code, I believe, in 2022. These are to be savings, proceeds from the savings of the closure of state centers that go directly to an IDA augmentation account, which is available then to community services. Very little money has been claimed as savings. There is still well over $100 million supporting several hundred people at the current state centers. And we just want to call out that is an available resource. More should be done to generate savings, liquidation of assets. Short term, as performance-based contracting is implemented, we feel there's going to be a high likelihood of shortfalls, and we want to make sure that that money stays in the system. So I think that is where we are at on comment letters. Again, you can take a read of those. I think they're both very relevant to performance-based contracting. And I will say some of the things that you have called out, not everything will make it into our letter. We have tried to really take high-level things we feel we can move the dial on effectively, but that doesn't mean we have forgotten about many of the other issues that we have talked about. Those will come up in discussion, and we encourage you to continue to follow up where opportunities are provided. So Craig, if we can move on into the provider summits. Again, we've talked about these summits a lot already. So the completion of the June 3rd, 10th, 12th, the final session coming up June 20th, I believe that's correct. So if you have not attended all of them, they are available at MyODP. Craig, we can talk about making sure. I know you sent the links out to the registrations and I believe to MyODP for these things. And if you've missed them, I would encourage you to download the deck, listen to the recording. They also provide the transcript, which is very useful because the transcript is sort of searchable. You can do a find if you're looking for, as I was preparing for this meeting, where did they talk about the performance analysis vendor? And I want to hear that discussion and listen to that again. So it's a really effective tool. If there's something that is very important to you that you may have heard or heard about, you can look at the transcript, search it, and you can go right to the comment and you can read what was said in the transcript as well. So I've probably mentioned a couple of these things already. The acknowledgement of current volume of comments, a lot of comments. I believe Kristen did give actual numbers. And the areas where there seems to be some indication of movement. So the final thing that I'd like to say here, the waiver application, there's some, it may sound in conflict to say that ODP still intends to submit its waiver application on or about July 1st, but there's tons of comments and they're still sifting through those. And we're hopeful that a lot of these performance measures or criteria may change. So, with that, I think it's important to recall, if you look at the actual application, the waiver applications that ODP has prepared, the amendments, but also the application for the first-time application for, technically speaking, a selective contracting waiver, there really is not a lot of detail in there. In some respects, it's somewhat similar to the provider contract we spoke about earlier in the session, in that it really lays out what it is. It talks about high level what ODP is going to do, but there's not an addendum that spells out the 83 performance standards or the tiers or how they're going to determine all that. So there is still a lot of flexibility. So I say that to be reassuring. Just because ODP does submit its waiver application, I do expect, not just in this cycle, but I think that there's opportunity and flexibility that ODP is reserving for itself going forward. And I think we would all agree, nobody really knows where this lands for a couple of years, but there has to be some opportunity to be flexible on it. So with the summits, I'll next go and just kind of wrap up with my own takeaways, and I kind of welcome anybody else here that has different takeaways important to you, things you think are really important for the entire system that you want to call out. Here are a few that I've heard of in commentary, probably most of this coming directly from Kristen Ahrens, but the performance analysis services vendor, of course, that's sort of factual. They're not engaging that vendor. They did put out an RFP. I think every intention was that it would be awarded in time to do some of this work. But the 100% compliance, I think, as I may have said earlier, we sense some movement, a lot of comments on this apparently. The acceptance of new referrals by needs group, again, something that the department seems willing to flex on to some degree. Employment metrics is another one I don't think I've talked about today. The embedding of employment standards for pay for performance and the need to meet performance criteria in employment has been called out in apparently a loud way and with many comments. So that is something that ODP is again looking at. And the primary tier for less than 10 individuals. I will say my prediction would be there are not going to be wholesale changes in these areas, but I think ODP certainly recognizes a lot of comment. And as I always like to remind ourselves, ODP does make changes based on public comment. It sometimes feels like nothing changes, we make a lot of comments, but I think that the record in history shows that how you weigh in, how effectively identifying things, calling out the reasons, making a recommendation, you can be very effective. So again, we thank folks for doing that. So let me stop there. I think I've seen some questions maybe pop in, Craig, so maybe help me out in sorting some of those.
So Patrick, there are a couple questions about the needs group 5, and there are a couple comments about the 4.5 CIS level and the 3.5 health score. Comments were there's not many providers, at least the thought is there's not a whole lot of providers who are finding that they're meeting that requirement. What is the department's position on that? Do you know?
They've acknowledged that they've received a lot of comment on that. That was one of the things before comment letter, we noted in talking with members and organizations across the state and other associations. And, I can't say anything more than I think that they have taken notice of that. I think that there are so many implications of that particular issue, how you would need to manage your own intake and referrals to maintain a certain criteria, because ODP is only asking you for this information once a year. I think it would be very important, again, back to our last session, we had Scott Bachik talking about your data and what you do with it. So I would unfortunately have to say, wait and see on that. I think ODP will do something in that area, is my sense, that they will allow organizations that are not in, that are in the primary tier, I guess I should word it the way they've worded it, to accept referrals. But that's not entirely clear to me. I don't want to say that I believe that will happen. I believe they are looking at options that they think that they could implement that they would be comfortable with.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? If you want to raise your hand, we can unmute mics.
And Craig, I don't know if with technical questions, some of the things are not visible. So I don't know how the chat settings Q&A. I mean, I always sort of say, if you want something asked publicly, please put it in Q&A. Craig's way better than me at sort of tracking everything. So we kind of want to get to everybody's comments and questions. So there's a clarification. Are you saying smaller providers will be able to support needs groups 4 or 5? I'm saying I think they're looking at it. I think I heard as recently as yesterday's session, they've heard a lot on that. They're considering that topic, but I don't think, and ODP emphasizes this as well, nothing in the documents has changed. They are presenting on as written. And the way it's worded, smaller providers so that you don't have the opportunity to be in, say, select or clinically enhanced tier, less than 10. By definition, yes, right now, that is how it would be if you're serving less than 10 people. So Craig, please highlight anything. I'm kind of surprised that we're this short on time. So I just want to briefly cover a few things and do a wrap up, and then circle back to any final questions we might have. So, these are our takeaways. Please, write yours in to Q&A. If you have others, we'll call them out. And we'll certainly, send all materials out after the session as well. So can you go next slide, Craig? And I just want to not take a lot of time to kind of talk about some of the things. I wanted to look at the foundation of sort of the numbers, the investment in rates, the investment in performance-based contracting. So the sources that I took a look at, these have been out there for a while. Obviously, the budget's been out for a while. The fiscal impact notices published technically April 20th when everything was pushed out for public comment. And the DHS Blue Book, I think by the end of February, a little more detailed look at what is in the budget. So next slide, Craig. This is really just our handout. Again, you can kind of go there. This is useful. You meet with legislators. You're talking to your DSPs, your board, any stakeholders, family members, and people you serve. This is collectively what the associations are asking for. So rather than go through the budget, you just see some numbers here. 266 million in federal funding, matching 217 million in state funding, $483 million invested into fee schedule rates. And the other elements in terms of initiatives, notably to get more people served from the waiting list. So the next slide is really kind of a look into what does the Blue Book say about the size of our system. And you can kind of see here, I called this out because the top line numbers there, state funds, you see this 1.877 billion figure a lot in public notices. The currently available this year funding, $2.29 billion, again, state only. And then this year's budget is the $2.645 billion. If you look at this footnote, reflects recommended appropriation reduction, $32.487 million. I want to call that out as really that's in addition to, if you think about 1 year ago at this time exactly, the $170 million clawback. This is sort of acknowledging that, as we said at the time, that was what they took. It looked like they were underspending quite a bit. Again, back to this 1.877 billion, but just to kind of frame size of IDA budget, what's in the budget. If you go to next slide, Craig. These are sort of the numbers. If you go through the Blue Book, you can kind of identify the initiatives, and there'll be an initiative for rate increases in the consolidated waiver and the community living waiver and PFDS waiver. It's also there in autism services, lesser dollar amounts. These are the major dollars. So the 217 includes autism, but I wanted to call out really the bottom left, 213, 722. If you go to the next slide, Craig, you can see this is, again, commentary from the Blue Book, page 235. The budget also provides $213.722 million to increase rates for community-based services. That's the ID waivers. That's the number that I just referred to in the previous slide. This will also support performance-based contracting. So it goes on to say, but basically I call it out to say there's not an additional line item in the budget anywhere. This is inclusive of rates and performance-based contracting. So a lot of this yet to be seen, yet to be determined information, really makes it clear from a budgetary standpoint. A, there's a lot of money that doesn't get spent, that sometimes gets clawed back. B, when we talk about rate increases and performance-based contracting, they're really kind of bundled into the same line item from an appropriations perspective. So next slide, and hopefully we're about done with kind of the financial analysis here. But yeah, this just sort of underscores this. If you look at the two publications, this is off a little bit, but I think the previous slide showed, 466, 467, or 476, 477. This is 477. Yeah, sorry, Craig. Just go back one more. Nope, sorry. I was looking for the grid. Yeah. So the 476, 160, go back to where we were, please. And it's roughly the same number. So, and granted that selective contracting is half a year total. So this will annualize, but it doesn't really increase. It stays pretty flat, roughly $100 million for the subsequent years if you look at how things are published. So next slide. And sorry, we're not going to have a lot of time for takeaways, but a few things that I just wanted to say here is really, you have to kind of look at measurement and what you're measuring right now. And I think that compare that to the what your goals are in terms of tiers and how far are you away. So this is sort of a different way of saying, what is the gap analysis? So how far away are you from your desired outcomes? And then for cost benefit analysis, and once you determine that and determine what it costs, you can now compare that to kind of, does 5% cover that? Does 8% cover that? And the statement about performance-based contracting not being a continuum, I'm only saying that in the sense that I don't think, and again, why I wanted to use the numbers, I don't think the expectation for the provider community can or should be that gradually more and more people are going to continue to qualify. The appropriations don't speak to that. And I think the clarity, and again, back to what I said about the closing of our comment letter, more clear communication on what provider organizations can do successfully to pursue success in all of the tiers, a strategy for success in every tier. And my reference to diversification, we've had a lot of things thrown out as ideas, but short term, there are things that you can do. There are organizations that look geographically to be in different service areas. There are organizations that look in different services and revenue streams. There are organizations that can look right within the ODP fee schedule and say, there are services we don't do that we think could be profitable for us. And I'm sure that there are many, many more. So because we're limited on time, we'll go, I think we have one more slide, Craig. And what I wanted to sort of talk about are next steps. Some of these partnerships, this involves things like NADSP or NAD for your credentialing, infrastructure. If you're looking at an EHR, but can you also partner with your physical health provider that serves most of your organization, so individuals? From the TPA's perspective, we want to look at health insurance. We want to look at finance, access to credit. We want to look at housing, and we want to bring in continued expertise. So my apologies if you go next slide. We didn't really leave any time here and we're a little bit over. I'll invite you to send us any questions, comments. We will take a look at the chat and the Q&A for anything we might have missed. We will certainly refer any questions over to Travis, and we're happy to, maybe Craig, when we put out the recording and materials, we can identify Travis with email for anybody that wants to reach out to him. So Craig, anything out there in the final 60 seconds before we close? Any key questions or anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I don't think so. I think we're at time now.
Okay. So I know, Karen, I just saw your NADSP popped in. I know we've been in contact with Joe Macbeth, so I think you might be calling that out to organizations here, and I agree. I know you brought that up on HR committee yesterday. So a good final thought and good recommendation. Get moving with things now. We'll continue to keep you informed. Thanks everybody for being here today. Have a great rest of your day and great weekend.